A millionaire was about to sign the contract that would save him from ruin when suddenly a poor 9-year-old girl burst into the boardroom and shouted in front of everyone, "Dad, don't sign that contract." There was complete silence, and what that girl was about to reveal would uncover a betrayal that would shake the entire room. Before continuing, be sure to subscribe and leave your like, because what comes next you will never forget. The silence in the boardroom was thick, as if even the air was waiting for the decision of one man. Ricardo Villalobos had the pen in his hand, the contract open in front of him, and 3 pairs of eyes watching him with the expectation of a predator waiting for the exact moment to attack. "Sign it, Ricardo," said Julian, his partner and lifelong friend, in a tone that sounded like advice, but hid barely disguised pressure. Ricardo looked at the pages. Numbers and clauses flooded him, as if they were cages where he was about to lock himself up forever. The company he had built over decades was faltering, and that contract was supposed to be its salvation. The metallic click of the pen opening echoed like a gunshot. Just as the tip was inches from the paper, the door to the room burst open. "Dad, don't sign that contract!" cried a childish voice, high-pitched, trembling, and determined at the same time. Everyone turned in unison. A girl with dark, messy hair, no older than 9, stood there with her eyes wide open and her hands clenched into fists. Her heavy breathing revealed that she had been running. The silence broke into an incredulous murmur. The investors looked at each other uncomfortably. Julian frowned in annoyance. Ricardo, paralyzed, held the pen in the air, not understanding what was happening. "What?" stammered the girl, pointing at him with a small but firm finger. "You're my dad, and they want to trick you." A louder murmur rippled through the room. The investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats while Julian tried to compose himself. "Who let this girl in?" he exclaimed with an authoritative gesture toward the door. No one answered. The security guard appeared nervously, trying to take the little girl away, but she resisted. "No," she shouted with tears in her eyes, but with surprising strength. "Dad, don't sign, it's a trap." Ricardo froze. The word "dad" hit him in the chest like an echo of something he had never heard in his life. He had no children. He had never had the opportunity or the luck. His failed marriage had left him with a wound that never healed. And now, suddenly, an unknown girl was calling him that in front of everyone. The guard tried to restrain her, but she clung to the conference table desperately. Her eyes were fixed on Ricardo's. "Listen to me, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I heard you talking. You want to take everything away from him." Ricardo slowly lowered the pen. The gesture sparked nervousness around the table. "What does this mean, Ricardo?" said one of the investors, his tone mixing annoyance and alarm. Was he going to let a girl interrupt $1 million deal? But Ricardo didn't answer. He looked at her, trying to understand who she was, what she was doing there, why she was saying those words. The boardroom, once cold and calculated, had been transformed into a chaotic scene where a single sentence had changed everything. "Dad." Ricardo swallowed, stood up slowly, walked over to the girl, and put a hand on her shoulder. "Who are you?" he asked in a whisper, as if afraid to hear the answer. The girl was breathing rapidly, her face flushed from the effort of resisting the guard. "I'm Mariana Torres, and if you sign that paper, you're going to lose everything." The investors erupted in protest. Julian banged on the table. "This is absurd. Security, get her out of here immediately." Ricardo raised his hand, stopping the guard. His gaze remained fixed on Mariana. Inside, something he couldn't describe began to grow. A knot in his stomach, a mixture of fear, confusion, and a pang of unexpected tenderness. She had called him dad, and even though he knew it couldn't be true, even though reason screamed that it was a mistake or a trick, his heart told him otherwise. "Nobody move," he ordered firmly. Silence filled the room again. The investors looked at him in disbelief. Julian clenched his fists under the table. Furious, Ricardo took a breath, looked at Mariana and then at the contract. A certainty dawned on him. Something was very wrong, and perhaps that girl had saved him at the last second. The tension was unbearable. The contract remained untouched on the table. Mariana, with tears in her eyes, did not take her eyes off it, and Ricardo, his pulse racing, knew that his life had just taken an irreversible turn. And the most disturbing thing was that he did not understand why the murmuring in the room did not stop. The investors talked among themselves. annoyed by the interruption, while Ricardo stood staring at the girl, who was still breathing heavily. The pen rested on the contract without having touched the paper. "This is unacceptable," thundered one of the men in suits, his face red with indignation. "Allowing a little girl to interrupt a negotiation of this level. What kind of circus are you running here, Villalobos?" Ricardo turned toward them slowly. His dark, cold eyes had changed expression. There was no anger, nor resignation, but doubt, and that doubt was enough to make everyone uncomfortable. "If you expect me to sign something of this magnitude, you will have to accept that I need to clarify certain things." The three investors looked at each other uneasily. Julian, sitting to Ricardo's right, leaned forward nervously. "Ricardo, listen to me," he said quietly, although everyone heard him. "You can't let some unknown girl jeopardize this deal. Do you know how many jobs depend on this signing? Do you know what it would mean to lose this opportunity?" His tone sounded like a warning, not friendly advice. Ricardo watched him silently. Julian had never hesitated when speaking to him. He was always direct, calm, confident. But now Ricardo noticed a nervousness in his gestures that he had never seen before. His hands were restless, his eyes avoided contact for too long, his voice was too hurried. "I know, Julian," Ricardo replied with tense calm, "and that's exactly why I need to make sure I'm making the right decision." The atmosphere grew heavier. One of the investors slammed his palm on the table. "This is disrespectful. We've been preparing this contract for weeks. Are you implying that there's something shady going on here?" Ricardo held his gaze firmly. "I'm saying I need more time. If your proposal is legitimate, it shouldn't be a problem." The ensuing silence was a battle of wills. The men in suits exchanged glances. They weren't used to someone opposing them so calmly. Julian was the first to relent. "All right," he said with a gesture of ill-concealed annoyance. "Let's take a break." The investors got up, muttering under their breath. The contract remained on the table like a bomb that had failed to explode. Ricardo looked at it one last time before leaving. As he opened the door, he found the girl in the hallway. Mariana hadn't moved. Her huge eyes followed him with a strange mixture of courage and fear. Ricardo felt a knot in his stomach. "You," he began to say, but a woman's voice interrupted him. Mariana, a woman in a simple uniform with her hair tied back and her hands still wet from cleaning products, came running. She took the girl's arm protectively, looking at her as if she had just recovered the most precious thing in the world. "What are you doing here?" she asked in a trembling voice, though full of relief. "I told you not to move from where you were." Mariana looked down, but did not let go of Ricardo's arm, as if she needed to cling to him. Ricardo stood watching the scene perplexed. The woman, who could only be the girl's mother, looked up and recognized him. Her eyes filled with shame and defiance at the same time. "Mr. Villalobos," she said in a low voice, almost a whisper. "I'm so sorry, we didn't mean to interrupt." Ricardo was about to respond, but he noticed that they were still in the main hallway, in full view of executives, assistants, and employees who had stopped to watch the commotion. "Come with me," he ordered in a firm voice. He led them both to a nearby private office, closed the door, and for the first time since the girl appeared, he was able to look at them face to face without the weight of other people's stares. Mariana was still clinging to her mother, but her eyes never left him. Ricardo leaned forward slightly, trying to ease the tension. "I need to understand," he said bluntly. "Why did you call me Dad?" The question hung in the air like a knife. Isabel, the mother, tensed and squeezed the girl's arm. "Mariana," she began to say, but the girl interrupted her. "Because you are." Ricardo's heart skipped a beat. "That's impossible," he replied, unable to hide the harshness in his voice. "I don't have any children." Isabel stepped forward, placing herself between them like a shield. "She didn't mean it that way," she said hastily. "She's confused. She just heard things she shouldn't have." Ricardo stared at her. He didn't know who this woman really was, or what her connection to all this was, but there was something in her tone that didn't sound like a complete lie. "Then explain it to me," he demanded with a calmness that hid the storm inside him. "What exactly did she hear, and why did she interrupt a meeting that could cost me my company?" Isabel hesitated. Her dark eyes blinked rapidly, as if looking for a way out. Finally, she squeezed Mariana's hand and sighed. "No, here," she murmured. "No, now." The silence was broken by a knock on the door. Julian poked his head in with a forced smile. Ricardo, the investors want an answer as soon as possible. You can't delay it much longer. Ricardo looked at him and for the first time in many years felt that there was something different about that familiar face. A shadow he hadn't noticed before. The face of suspicion. Tell them they'll have to wait, he replied sharply. He closed the door without giving him time to reply. Julian stood in the hallway with his lips pressed tightly together, while inside Ricardo turned his attention to the girl and the woman they had just shattered into 1,000 pieces. The solid ground on which he thought he was walking. The office was filled with silence. Ricardo, standing in front of the window, kept his arms crossed as he watched the city spread out below him. He wasn't really looking at the landscape. He was thinking about the girl's face, about the conviction with which she had called him dad. Behind him, Isabel clutched her purse to her chest as if she feared someone might snatch it away. Mariana stood next to her, restless, but without taking her eyes off Ricardo. Finally, he broke the silence. This was a setup, right? His voice sounded firm without raising it, but with the harshness of a judge handing down a sentence, a scene planned to stop the signing. Who hired you? Who instructed you to say all that? Isabel blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to accuse her so directly. Setup, she repeated incredulously. Mr. Villalobos, I'm a cleaner, not an actress. Ricardo turned with a skeptical expression. Then explain to me why your daughter interrupts a $1 million meeting. Why do you call me dad in front of everyone? Why do you say there's a trap? Isabel swallowed hard. She wasn't used to someone powerful looking at her like that, with that mixture of superiority and distrust. She had spent years walking the halls like a ghost. No one spoke to her. No one saw her except to give her quick orders or complain about her work. And now, for the first time, she had the eyes of the owner of everything fixed on her. She took a deep breath. Because we heard it, Ricardo frowned. They heard conversations in the hallways, in offices they thought were empty, men coming and going late when almost no one was left. They thought no one could hear them, but sounds bounce off walls, travel, and Mariana has very good hearing. The girl nodded immediately. It's the bad men, she said in a clear voice as if the phrase were already engraved in her. They talk loudly when they think they're alone. I hid and listened. Ricardo looked at the girl. There was a conviction in her eyes that disturbed him. It didn't sound like a rehearsed lie. It sounded like someone who had seen too much for her age. And what exactly did you hear? He asked in a lower tone, though still full of mistrust. Mariana pressed her lips together and then leaned toward her mother as if seeking permission. Isabel stroked her hair and encouraged her to speak. They said that if you signed, you would have nothing left, that they would take everything away from you, that you wouldn't realize it until it was too late. The words fell like stones in the heavy air of the office. Ricardo closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't want to believe it. It all sounded absurd, and yet there was something disturbing about the accuracy with which the girl repeated the phrases. This doesn't make sense, he muttered, more to himself than to them. You can't be here making things up that jeopardize a negotiation like this. Isabel took a step forward. For the first time, her voice did not tremble. Do you think I would risk my daughter's future to make something up? I've worked here for years cleaning up after others. No one sees me, no one hears me, but I've learned to recognize when something smells bad. And believe me, Mr. Villalobos, what they're preparing against you stinks from a mile away. Ricardo looked at her, bewildered. There was a fierce confidence in her gaze, a dignity he didn't expect to find in a woman in a cleaning uniform. It was as if life had beaten her so many times that she no longer knew how to be afraid. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard. Finally, Ricardo sighed and sat down on the edge of the desk. And what am I supposed to do with this? He asked with a gesture of frustration. Stop the world because a little girl says she heard bad men. Mariana raised her voice, almost shouting, They're just bad men. I heard them say your name. The echo of that phrase bounced off the walls. Ricardo stood motionless. Mariana was breathing fast, her eyes shining with intensity. Isabel hugged her, trying to calm her down, but the girl insisted. They wanted you to sign so they could take everything. They said so, I remember. Ricardo ran a hand over his tired face. He didn't know what to do with that information. He couldn't trust them so easily, but he also couldn't ignore the force with which they said it. He looked at Isabel, then at Mariana, and although their words still echoed like an incomplete puzzle, something inside him told him not to sign anything. Not until he understood what the hell was really going on. The problem was that at that moment he had no idea who he could trust. The silence in the office seemed heavier than the air itself. Ricardo had turned off all the lights when he entered, leaving only the deathly light of the city to filter through the huge window. The illuminated towers and distant traffic seemed to belong to another world, one where everything continued on its course, indifferent to the chaos that had just disrupted his life. In the darkness, the contract lay open on the table, that stack of printed pages, until a couple of hours ago a symbol of salvation, now felt like a trap waiting for him to sign his name. Ricardo stared at the lines, but all he could hear in his mind was the high-pitched voice of the girl who had interrupted him. "Dad, don't sign that contract." Isabel stood by the door, rigid, as if ready to run away if ordered to do so. She clutched the bag slung over her shoulder tightly, as if it contained more than just personal items, as if it were a shield. Mariana, on the other hand, was sitting on a chair in front of the desk. Her feet dangled without reaching the floor, and she played with the sleeves of her sweater, but her eyes remained fixed on Ricardo. There was no fear in them. There was a mixture of curiosity and a strange determination inappropriate for her age. Ricardo took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. Finally, he leaned forward with his hands resting on the table. "You said you heard phrases." His tone was serious, sharp, like that of a lawyer in an interrogation. "Repeat them word for word." Mariana stopped moving her hands. She looked at him with the seriousness of someone who knew the importance of what she was about to say. "When I sign, you won't realize that what you're giving up is everything." The words came out of her mouth clean, firm, without the slightest hesitation. Isabel looked down nervously, as if she feared that Ricardo's reaction would turn against them. The businessman raised an eyebrow. "That's what they said." The girl nodded, yes, and she also closed her eyes as if searching an inner library. "He thinks he needs us, but in reality we have him cornered." Ricardo froze. The echo of that phrase hit him hard. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. The intonation, the cadence, even the emphasis on certain words. It was the same arrogance he had heard just days ago when one of the investors spoke to him with a condescending smile. "You're cornered, Villalobos." It was almost identical. He moved away from the desk, pacing back and forth across the office like a caged lion. His footsteps echoed on the wood, marking the beat of his disordered thoughts. "It can't be," he muttered under his breath. Mariana watched him without blinking. "I remember everything," she said with the certainty of someone stating an indisputable fact. "When I hear something important, I don't forget it." Ricardo stopped dead in his tracks. "Have you always had that memory?" Mariana shrugged as if she were talking about something obvious. "My teacher says so. I know poems, songs, even my classmates' homework. Sometimes they ask me to remind them of what they've forgotten." Isabel nodded shyly, speaking for the first time since the confession began. "It's true, she has a strange memory. I surprise myself. She remembers things I heard only once and have already forgotten." Ricardo resumed walking with his hands on his hips. His disbelief fought against something deeper. Everything in his business training screamed that he should rely on facts, on tangible evidence, not on the words of a child. But there were details that were impossible to ignore. The accuracy of the phrases, the tone, the way they matched expressions he had heard from the very men who were now waiting for his signature. He remembered the haughty face of one of the investors, the one with the ostentatious gold watch. He had smiled as he said, "You think you need our help." But in reality, Ricardo never finished hearing that sentence because Julian interrupted him. Now Mariana had just completed it without knowing it. The coincidence was too precise. He turned to them with narrowed eyes. "If what you say is true, Mariana, someone inside my company wants to destroy me." The girl held his gaze without blinking. "I heard it. They wanted you to sign so they could take everything." Isabel stroked her daughter's hair as if to protect her from her own memory. Her voice, though soft, was filled with quiet conviction. "We're not making this up, Mr. Villalobos. You may doubt us. I understand. But what Mariana heard is real." Ricardo approached the desk again. His hand slammed the contract shut with a thud that echoed through the room. I'm not signing anything until I know what's going on here. Isabel's breathing eased a little, as if she had finally managed to open a crack of trust. Her lips moved to form a question she didn't dare to say aloud. Do you believe us? Ricardo looked at her. He wasn't ready to admit it out loud yet, but something deep in his mind had changed. The seed of doubt had taken root, and he could no longer pull it out. He looked at the girl again. The frankness in her eyes disconcerted him, disarmed him. He thinks he needs us, but in reality we have him cornered. The echo of that phrase repeated itself like a mantra in his head. He had heard it before, and now he knew it wasn't a figment of his imagination. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched came over him, as if the shadows in the office had eyes. And it was at that moment that Ricardo Villalobos, for the first time in his life, feared that the real danger was not outside, but sitting there waiting patiently for him to make a mistake. Ricardo turned on a small lamp in the corner of his office. The warm light illuminated only part of the space, leaving the rest in darkness, as if the place itself had held secrets. Mariana, exhausted, had fallen asleep in a chair with her head resting on her arms. Isabel covered her with her jacket, taking care not to wake her. Ricardo watched her silently. That simple scene had an unexpected edge to it. Seeing the girl sleep caused him a pang of tenderness mixed with unease. He was not used to such feelings. He had always kept his life in compartments. Business on one side, marital failure on the other, and then emptiness. He walked to the window. The city sparkled below, indifferent as ever. His reflection in the glass showed him the face of a man who was successful in the eyes of the world, but who inside carried a void that was impossible to fill. The word echoed again in his memory. Dad. Mariana's cry had opened a dark room inside him, full of memories he had decided to shut away years ago. He remembered Laura, his ex-wife. He remembered the long arguments, the constant reproaches, the accumulated disappointment. They had tried to have children, but the news they were hoping for never came. Over time, frustration turned into distance, and distance into resentment. She accused him of always putting the company first. He accused her of not understanding his ambition. The marriage slowly fell apart until one day Laura left without looking back. Since then, the idea of being a father had been buried under tons of work and contracts. He had accepted that he was not cut out for family life, that his legacy would be the company. And now, suddenly, an unknown girl was calling him dad in front of everyone. Ricardo closed his eyes and put his hand to his forehead. The confusion was overwhelming him. I didn't expect the word to weigh so heavily on him, Isabel said suddenly in a low voice. Ricardo turned. She was leaning against the wall, looking at him, as if she had read his mind. You have no idea, he replied curtly. Isabel held his gaze. There was something about the way she looked at him that was not servile, as he was used to seeing in other employees. It was a direct, unadorned gaze, charged with the silent dignity of someone who has been ignored for too long. No one in this company expects anything from me, she said, crossing her arms. I'm the woman who cleans the hallways, who moves in the shadows so that others can work in shiny offices. I hear things I shouldn't. I see gestures that others pretend don't exist, and yet to them, I'm nothing more than part of the furniture. Invisible. The word echoed uncomfortably in the office. Invisible. Ricardo frowned. She's implying that all this, that what her daughter said, is the result of spending too much time listening to conversations that are none of her business. Isabel straightened her back. She didn't seem offended. She seemed tired of that always being the response. What I'm saying is that there is more truth in what we hear, those of us who don't matter, than in what is discussed at these fancy tables. Ricardo remained silent. It was strange. He didn't entirely trust her, but he couldn't dismiss her words either. Isabel spoke with a confidence that was not that of someone trying to deceive. There was pain in her voice, yes, but also certainty. He approached the table again and sank into the armchair. I don't know at what point my company became a place where someone like you could feel invisible, he admitted with a sincerity that surprised even himself. And that says more about me than anyone else. Isabel blinked in surprise at the confession. For a moment, the wall between them cracked. Silence reigned once more. Only the quiet breathing of Mariana, fast asleep, could be heard. Ricardo looked at her again. Her small body was curled up as if seeking refuge. Something inside him stirred. He knew he shouldn't get involved, that it was prudent to keep his distance, but he could no longer deny the obvious. There was something about that girl and her mother that drew him into unknown territory. An uncomfortable, inevitable alliance was beginning to take shape. And although Ricardo would not admit it out loud, he knew that this bond, still weak, could become his only line of defense against the shadows that were beginning to close in on him. The early morning hours passed silently in the main office. Mariana slept soundly on a sofa covered by her mother's jacket. Ricardo, on the other hand, was far from finding rest. In front of his computer screen, his red, tired eyes scanned figures, balance sheets, and digital contracts. For the past hour, he had been browsing through internal files, looking for any detail that might make sense of the phrases Mariana had repeated. He didn't expect to find anything until an anomaly stopped him in his tracks. A transfer document showing millions of pesos leaving one of his corporate accounts for an external fund in Panama. Ricardo opened the file and checked the sender of the authorization, Julian Torres, his partner and friend of 3 decades. His throat closed up, and he nervously moved the cursor, opening another similar file, another transfer, this time disguised as a payment to suppliers. Same authorizer, Julian. He felt the blood pounding in his temples. The man who had been by his side since the beginning, who had celebrated every achievement with him and cried over every failure, now appeared to be directly responsible for transactions that had never been approved by him. He jumped up, moving away from the desk as if the computer had exploded. He walked to the window, clenching his fists. Everything in him cried out for denial. It was impossible that Julian, his Julian, was behind this. A slight creak brought him back to reality. Isabel was awake, watching him from the chair where she had been sitting with their daughter. She said nothing at first. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You found it, didn't you?" Her voice was soft but full of certainty. Ricardo turned to her in surprise. "What are you saying?" Isabel got up slowly, careful not to wake Mariana. She walked over to him and lowered her voice. "I saw it too. Documents, movements that didn't add up." Ricardo looked at her skeptically, although inside a spark of hope told him that maybe she knew more. "How do you know?" Isabel hesitated for a moment, as if debating between keeping quiet or revealing something she had kept hidden for too long. Finally, she opened her purse and took out a folded envelope, worn by the years. "Because I kept them." Ricardo took it suspiciously, opened the envelope, and found inside old photocopies, duplicate invoices, contracts with different signatures, transfers with suspicious stamps. Some were dated more than 6 years ago. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his tone oscillating between surprise and disbelief from the trash cans of this same company. Isabel held his gaze firmly. "I cleaned offices after meetings where they think they're untouchable. I've picked up torn papers. I've seen abandoned documents. For years I thought I shouldn't meddle, but when something told me that this wasn't normal, I kept them." Ricardo leafed through each copy with trembling hands. It wasn't conclusive evidence yet, but it all pointed in the same direction. Someone had been systematically embezzling money, taking advantage of his blind trust in his managers. And Julian appeared in too many places. "Why didn't you say anything before?" he asked, staring at Isabel. She pressed her lips together. Who was she going to tell? "No one listens to a woman like me. I'm the cleaner, the one with no voice. If I had dared to speak up, they would have fired me in a second." Ricardo felt a jolt of reality. The invisibility she had spoken of in the previous chapter was now evident. For years she had held the truth in her hands, but the world had silenced her. He slumped into his chair with the documents in his hands. Julian whispered incredulously. "It can't be." Isabel looked at him seriously. "I know it hurts, but those papers don't lie. And your partner isn't the man you think he is either." Ricardo closed his eyes. He had known him since college. They had dreamed together of building a company that would stand the test of time. How could he now find that same man to be the traitor trying to bring him down? Anger began to rise in his chest, anger mixed with disappointment. It wasn't just a business betrayal, it was personal. He got up, walked to the window, and clenched his fists. The city continued to shine outside, impassive, while his world began to crumble. "If this is true," he finally said in a firm voice, though broken inside, "then I am more alone than I imagined." Isabel, a few feet away, looked down as if she understood all too well the weight of that sentence. Silence spread, broken only by the quiet breathing of Mariana, still asleep. Ricardo looked at the envelope with the documents and knew he couldn't ignore them. The shadow of Julian, his partner, his friend, had become the first visible face of a betrayal that was just beginning to show its fangs. The day dawned gray with an overcast sky that seemed to foreshadow a storm. Isabel walked down the company hallway with her head down, as she always did, but with the difference that now she felt an invisible weight on her shoulders. In her bag, she carried the envelope she had given Ricardo the night before, now empty, although the memory of what it contained burned like a burden. At the front door, while waiting for Mariana, who was running after her with her backpack, she noticed something strange. A white envelope lay on the floor, just under the doormat. It had no return address. She picked it up cautiously, looking around. No one seemed to pay any attention to her. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was only a sheet of paper with printed capital letters. Don't meddle in things that are none of your business. Next time, it won't just be a warning. Isabel felt her blood run cold. She pressed the paper against her chest as if she wanted to make it disappear. At that moment, Mariana came up beside her. "What's that, Mom?" asked the girl, trying to read over her shoulder. "Nothing," Isabel replied quickly, putting the sheet of paper in her bag. "Just trash." But Mariana looked at her with those big eyes that seemed to see through any lie. She didn't insist, but she remained serious. Too serious for her age. That day, as she left the office, something else happened. The sky was already dark, and a fine drizzle was falling on the streets. Isabel was walking hand in hand with Mariana when the girl tugged on her arm. "Mom, that car," she whispered, pointing discreetly behind them. Isabel glanced sideways. A black sedan with tinted windows was driving slowly a few meters away. The engine purred softly, keeping pace with their steps. "Don't look so fine, so much," Mariana added, lowering her voice. "It's been following us since the corner." Isabel's heart began to beat faster. She quickened her pace without saying anything. The car did the same. She tried to convince herself that it was a coincidence, that perhaps the driver was just taking the same route. But when she turned at the next street and noticed that the vehicle was also turning, her illusion was shattered. Isabel squeezed her daughter's hand tighter. "Run," she whispered. They both began to jog in the rain. The sound of the engine behind them became more evident, like a stalking animal. Isabel looked for a place to take refuge. In the distance, she recognized Ricardo getting out of his car in front of the company, talking on the phone. Without thinking, she ran toward him. "Mr. Villalobos," she shouted, her voice broken with fear. Ricardo looked up in surprise. He saw Isabel and Mariana running, soaked and distraught. Behind them, he noticed the black sedan slowing down. He hung up the phone immediately. "What's going on?" Isabel couldn't answer. She took the paper out of her bag and handed it to him with trembling hands. Ricardo read it in seconds. The threat was clear, direct. He turned his gaze back to the car. The vehicle remained half a block away with the engine running. No one got out, but the tension it radiated was enough to make your skin crawl. Ricardo understood instantly. This wasn't paranoia, it wasn't exaggeration. Someone wanted to silence them. He stood in front of Isabel and Mariana, instinctively protecting them with his body. "Get in my car, right now." Isabel hesitated for a second, but Ricardo's steady gaze dispelled any resistance. She took Mariana and ran toward Villalobos' vehicle. Ricardo took one last look at the sedan. The car remained motionless, like a predator waiting for its moment. Then, with a roar of the engine, it turned and disappeared into the wet street. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the chase. Inside the car, as he started the engine, Ricardo felt a chill run down his spine. There was no longer any doubt. Someone was behind it all and was willing to do anything to silence them. For the first time, the weight of the threat ceased to be a rumor in his mind and became an overwhelming certainty. "This is just the beginning," he muttered, more to himself than to them. Isabel, with her arms around Mariana, heard him, and although she said nothing, she understood that he was right. The rain pounded the windshield as the car drove down the deserted avenue. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with a metallic squeak, marking the pulse of the silence that reigned inside the car. Isabel held Mariana against her chest. still trembling, while the girl stared out the side window, as if afraid that the black car would reappear at any moment. Ricardo drove with his knuckles tense on the steering wheel. He kept checking the rearview mirror. There were no signs of anyone following them, but the tension was getting on his nerves. He had learned to recognize danger in the business world, although it had always been limited to silent betrayals, power moves disguised as diplomacy. This, however, was different. Written threats, persecution in the middle of the street, a woman and a girl under his responsibility. When they reached an intersection, Ricardo spoke for the first time since they left the company. "We can't go back to your houses. Not tonight." Isabel looked at him, her voice breaking. "Where are we supposed to go?" Ricardo gripped the steering wheel. "I have a place, a house in the suburbs. Almost no one knows about it. I bought it years ago to get away for a couple of weekends, but I rarely use it. It's safe." Isabel wanted to protest, but Mariana looked up at Ricardo. Her dark eyes watched him with a mixture of fear and trust. "We'll be safe there," the girl whispered. Ricardo looked at her in the rearview mirror. He felt a lump in his throat. "Yes, Mariana, as long as I'm there, I won't let anything happen to you." The girl nodded slowly and, for the first time since she had known him, looked at him as one looks at a father. Isabel noticed the gesture and looked down, uncomfortable. There was something about this budding relationship that moved her and unsettled her at the same time. Ricardo's house was located on a hill on the outskirts of the city. An iron gate welcomed them, opening with a code that only he knew. The damp stone path led them to a modern building with clean lines, surrounded by trees that whispered in the rain. Upon entering, Isabel was surprised. It was a spacious, elegant, but lonely house. The spaces were impeccable, almost cold, as if they had been waiting for years for someone to bring them to life. Mariana walked cautiously through the room, observing every detail. The abstract paintings, the leather sofas, the unlit fireplace. Finally, she sat down in one of the armchairs, hugging her knees. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, "but it seems sad." Ricardo heard her and the phrase struck him more than he expected. Yes, the house was beautiful, but it was empty, just like her life. While Isabel settled in, he lit the fireplace. The fire illuminated Mariana's face, who was mesmerized by the flames. Ricardo took a seat in front of them. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Only the crackling of the fire filled the room. Finally, Isabel broke the silence. "I don't understand why you're doing this. You have no obligation to us." Ricardo looked at her seriously because someone had made them a target and because he paused, surprised by what he was about to admit. "Because I feel it's the right thing to do." Isabel held his gaze. There was something in the firmness of his voice that disarmed her, even though her pride resisted trusting him completely. "I'm not used to anyone protecting us," she admitted, looking down at her daughter. "We've always been alone." Ricardo didn't know how to respond. He looked at Mariana, who was staring at him again with an intensity that made him uncomfortable and moved him. There was something about that girl that completely threw him off balance, something that made him feel responsible in a way he had never experienced before. Without thinking too much about it, he leaned toward her. "I promise I won't leave you alone," he said quietly, almost solemnly. "No matter what happens, Mariana." She smiled faintly, but that small curve of her lips was enough to make Ricardo feel something inside him change. Isabel watched the scene in silence. She said nothing, but she knew that this man, for reasons she did not yet understand, was slowly becoming an unexpected refuge. And although neither of them recognized it yet, that newly formed bond was destined to unite them more than they could have imagined. The morning at the house on the hill dawned in thick silence. The singing of a few birds broke the calm, but inside the living room, all that could be heard was the crackling of the embers left over from the fireplace lit the night before. Ricardo had spent most of the early morning awake, mentally reviewing the financial transactions he had found on the computer and the copies Isabel had given him. He knew that suspicions were not enough. He needed more compelling evidence, something that could not be denied even in court. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, Isabel approached him with a thoughtful expression. She had dark circles under her eyes, a sign that she had not slept well either. "Mr. Villalobos," she said, lowering her voice as if afraid that someone else might hear. "There's something I didn't show you yesterday." Ricardo looked up in surprise. "More documents." She nodded. "They're at the company. I hid them a while ago in a place where no one would bother to look. An old cleaning closet in the basement. Ricardo frowned. Why there? Because no one pays attention to a closet full of mops and brooms, Isabel replied bluntly. I realized that the documents I found were too important to throw away. But if I took them home, I ran the risk of someone discovering them. That closet is the closest thing I have to a safe. Ricardo looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and respect. This woman, whom everyone treated as invisible, had had the courage to hide compromising information right under everyone's noses. I need to see them, she said firmly. Hours later, they returned discreetly to the company. Ricardo used a side entrance to avoid prying eyes. The building looked the same as always, with employees coming and going, absorbed in their tasks, unaware of the poison running through the veins of the company. Isabel walked ahead, guiding him through less traveled corridors. Mariana stayed at the house on the hill under the care of a trusted assistant that Ricardo had called that same morning. They reached the basement. The place was poorly lit, with flickering fluorescent tubes. The air smelled of dampness and disinfectant. Isabel stopped in front of a rusty metal cabinet with peeling paint. She took a bunch of keys from her uniform pocket and unlocked the cabinet. Inside were brooms, buckets, and bottles of cleaning products. But behind a damp cardboard panel, Isabel reached in and pulled out a package wrapped in black plastic. She placed it on a nearby table and opened it carefully. Here it is. Ricardo leaned over the papers. There were dozens of sheets, contracts, receipts, bank statements. Some were signed with his own name, but he knew he had never authorized those transactions. He took one of the documents and examined it carefully. His signature appeared at the bottom of the page, but there was a detail that only someone very close to him would notice. The signature was too perfect. His real signature always had a slight slant at the end, the result of haste. This one, however, was impeccable. Traced, forged. He muttered, clutching the paper between his fingers. He checked more pages, contracts with non-existent suppliers, million-dollar transfers to accounts in tax havens, duplicate invoices. It was a carefully designed scheme hidden among the tangle of the company's legitimate operations. Ricardo felt a chill. The fraud was much deeper than he had imagined. It wasn't just small leaks of money. It was an entire network of diversions that had been operating for years. This is not the work of one man, he said quietly, almost to himself. Isabel watched him closely. I thought so too, he admitted. There are too many papers, too many hands involved. But the most serious thing is that Julian's name always appeared on the authorizations. Ricardo clenched his teeth. His partner, the one he had trusted blindly, was once again emerging as a central figure. He remained silent for a few seconds, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Then he looked at Isabel. You noticed it before anyone else. Why did you keep it all to yourself? Why take the risk? She looked him straight in the eye because someone had to. And even if no one listens to me, I know what I saw. I always thought that one day everything would come to light, and now it seems that day has arrived. Ricardo straightened up, clutching the bundle of documents tightly. He felt a different weight in his hands. Not just papers, but the first real proof that behind the facade of his company lay a conspiracy that could destroy everything. It was no longer just suspicions or memories of a girl with a prodigious memory. Now he had physical evidence, signed and sealed. The fraud was not a rumor, it was a tangible truth that had been buried in the darkness of a cleaning closet. And Ricardo knew with a shudder that if he now had them in his hands, he also ran the risk of becoming the next target. The early morning was heavy and humid, with a wind that made the branches of the trees around the house on the hill creak. Ricardo couldn't sleep. He had spent hours reviewing the documents Isabel had rescued from the cleaning closet, trying to decipher the magnitude of the fraud. Each page sank him deeper into a disturbing certainty. He was facing an enemy who not only wanted his company, but also wanted to silence any obstacle. He got up from the living room chair and went to the window. Outside, fog partially covered the garden. The reflection in the glass showed him his tense face with dark circles under his eyes. But behind it, he thought he could make out a shadow moving among the trees. He frowned, approached cautiously, and turned off the lamp to see better. There was a fleeting silhouette slipping away along the fence. Before he could react, a metallic noise echoed at the back door. Someone was trying to force it open. Ricardo ran into the hallway. Isabel, who had come out of her room alarmed by the noise, met him in the middle of the corridor. "What was that?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Someone's trying to get in." The color drained from Isabel's face. She immediately thought of Mariana, who was sleeping in the next room. "My daughter." Ricardo raised a hand. "Calm down, I'll take care of it." He took out his phone and dialed a short number. On the other end of the line, the firm voice of a private guard answered, one of the few trusted men he still had left. "We have intruders. Check the perimeter." He hung up and grabbed an iron cane that was next to the fireplace. It wasn't a firearm, but it would do if the situation demanded it. The seconds seemed to last forever. The pounding on the back door became more insistent until it suddenly stopped. A tense silence spread throughout the house, as if the intruders were holding their breath. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the kitchen window. Shattered glass fell to the floor. "Back up!" Ricardo shouted, pushing Isabel into the hallway. The front door burst open and the guard entered, gun in hand. Ricardo pointed him toward the kitchen. There, a hooded man managed to climb through the broken window, but as soon as he set foot inside, the guard pointed his gun at him. The intruder quickly backed away and disappeared into the darkness of the garden. Two others followed him, leaving footprints in the damp earth. The guard ran after them, but the hooded men managed to escape in a vehicle that roared away. Silence returned, broken only by the crying of Mariana, who had been awakened by the commotion. Ricardo ran to her room and found her standing, hugging her teddy bear, her eyes wide with terror. "Daddy," she cried and threw herself into his arms. Ricardo's heart stopped for a second. He didn't have time to process the word. He just held her in his arms, covering her with his body. "It's over. You're safe," he told her. Although he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Mariana was trembling. She buried her face in his chest and spoke in a whisper. I heard." Ricardo pulled her away a little to look at her. "What did you hear?" A voice among the men outside. Her eyes were shining with tears, but her memory seemed stronger than her fear. It was Julian. The silence in the room became absolute. Isabel, who had just arrived, looked at him in horror. Ricardo clenched his jaw. He didn't want to believe it, but the certainty in the girl's voice pierced him like a knife. If it was true that Julian was among the attackers, then the betrayal was not only financial, it was personal and much more dangerous than he had imagined. As the guard returned, reporting that he had not been able to catch anyone, Ricardo stroked Mariana's hair, trying to calm her down. Inside, however, he knew that the calm was over. The enemies were no longer hiding behind forged contracts. Now they were banging on the doors of his refuge in the middle of the night, and they would do it again. The sun had barely risen when Ricardo came down the stairs of the house on the hill. He had his jacket slung over his arm, and his expression hardened by a sleepless night. He hadn't slept. The image of the hooded figures lurking among the trees had kept him awake. But above all, the memory of Mariana clinging to his chest, insisting that she had recognized Julian's voice. That statement was like a burning nail in his mind. He refused to believe it, but he couldn't ignore it. He had shared half his life with Julian. Together they had built the company from tiny offices. They had shared defeats and celebrated victories. They had been partners, friends, almost brothers. And yet, the discovered transfers, the forged documents, and the trembling voice of a little girl pointed to him. Isabel stepped out into the hallway with a tired expression. "He's coming out." Ricardo paused to adjust his tie. "Yes, I'm going to talk to Julian." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" she asked with a hint of concern that she made no attempt to hide. "If he's really behind what happened last night." Ricardo interrupted her calmly, although his eyes reflected a storm. "That's exactly why I need to look him in the eye." Isabel nodded silently, but the tension remained between them. The corporate building welcomed him with its usual glitz. Mirrored glass, smiling receptionists, employees in impeccable suits walking hurriedly. Ricardo found it ironic. From the outside, everything seemed to run like clockwork. Only he knew that the machinery was rusted and corroded. He ignored the curious glances and went straight to the top floor. He didn't even wait for the secretary to announce him. He opened the door abruptly and entered Julian's office. His partner was sitting behind his desk, leafing through some documents with his usual calm. The neatness of his gray suit and the shine of his gold cufflinks contrasted with Ricardo's tension. Ricardo, what a surprise, said Julian, looking up and smiling with rehearsed courtesy. I thought you'd be resting after everything that happened yesterday. We need to talk. The dry, sharp tone was enough to wipe the smile off his face. Julian put the papers aside and leaned back in his chair, crossing his fingers. I'm listening. Ricardo approached the desk, leaning over the polished surface. Last night, 3 hooded men tried to break into the house, and someone I trust completely assured me that he recognized your voice among them. Julian stared at him without blinking. Then he let out a slight, incredulous laugh. Are you accusing me of sending thugs to your house? Of participating in an assault? Not an assault, Ricardo replied harshly, in an attempt to intimidate him. Julian's face remained expressionless, although his eyes had a cold gleam. Ricardo, my friend, he pronounced the word with calculated emphasis. We've been working together for 30 years. Do you really think I would do something like that? I've found suspicious transfers authorized with your signature, duplicate invoices, forged contracts. And now this. Julian's mask of serenity cracked for just a second, enough for Ricardo to notice. You're paranoid, Julian finally said in a cold voice. Since when do you trust the gossip of a cleaning lady and the imagination of a little girl more than you trust me? The phrase hit Ricardo like an insult. It's not gossip, he replied in a low, restrained voice, but one laden with fury. It's facts, and if you have something to explain, now is the time. For a few seconds, they sized each other up in silence. The tension was so thick it seemed to fill the air. Finally, Julian rose from his chair, adjusting his tie with a deliberate gesture. I have nothing to explain to you, he said, walking toward the door. You're the one who's losing your mind, Ricardo. The pressure that's driving you crazy. Ricardo followed him with his eyes. The words did not sound like the concern of a partner, but like a veiled threat. If I continue down this path, Julian repeated before opening the door, I will end up destroying myself. And he left without waiting for a response. Ricardo was left alone in the office, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. He had wanted to find a resounding denial, a gesture of genuine surprise. Instead, what he got was coldness and contempt. Confirmation came quickly, but not from Julian, but from the press. That same afternoon, as he tried to concentrate on the numbers in a report, his assistant burst into his office with a distraught look on his face. Mr. Villalobos, look at this. He handed him a tablet. A headline in red letters appeared on the screen. Villalobos under investigation. Forged contracts and illegal transfers rock his company. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat, slid his finger across the screen, and began to read. The article showed excerpts from documents, the same ones Isabel had given him, but edited in such a way as to make him appear to be primarily responsible. There were underlined phrases, highlighted numbers, and his signature at the bottom of the pages. A signature he knew was forged, but which to anyone else's eyes was identical. The journalist spoke of internal sources close to the management circle and reliable leaks revealing a web of corruption at the peak of the company. Ricardo closed his eyes for a second, swallowing his anger. Someone inside had leaked those papers, selecting just the ones that incriminated him. It was no coincidence. It was a calculated move, and the list of suspects was narrowed down to one person. When he opened his eyes again, his reflection in the glass of the window showed him the image of a cornered man. Julian's face overlapped in his mind with the icy calm he had shown that morning. The betrayal was no longer a ghost in the dark. It was real, public, and designed to destroy him. Ricardo took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. He knew he couldn't let himself be overcome by rage, but inside, one truth was becoming increasingly clear. If he wanted to save himself, he would have to confront those he had considered his own family until yesterday. Ricardo's phone wouldn't stop buzzing, calls, messages, emails, a storm that enveloped him without giving him a break. Since dawn, the headlines had been hitting him like hammer blows. Villalobos, under suspicion of million-dollar fraud, the untouchable businessman, now in the crosshairs of justice. A fortune built on fake contracts. Images of his face appeared on all the news programs. Some were official photos, smiling at business conferences. Others were taken out of context, showing him with a stern, almost guilty expression. Ricardo turned off the screen and slumped into the armchair in his office. He felt a tiredness different from physical exhaustion, a moral weariness, a mixture of rage and helplessness. He knew perfectly well what was happening. This was not an isolated leak, but a well-planned campaign. Investors had released an avalanche of manipulated evidence to the press, designed to construct a narrative, that of a corrupt businessman who had defrauded his own country. Isabel entered the room with a frown, a folded newspaper in her hand. "Look at this," she said, handing it to him. Ricardo took it and opened it. On the front page was his photograph alongside a devastating headline. Villalobos' empire reels. Corruption allegations rock the business elite. "It's not true," Ricardo muttered. Even though he knew that phrase, repeated 1,000 times, would carry no weight against the media machine that had already condemned him in the court of public opinion. Isabel watched him silently. Her eyes reflected concern, but also something else, a spark of shared indignation. "They have the power of the media," she said, "but you have something they don't. The truth." Ricardo let out a bitter laugh. "The truth," he repeated, as if the word tasted like iron. "What good is it when everyone prefers to believe the lie?" He got up and walked to the window. From there, the city looked the same as always, with cars driving by and offices lit up. However, he knew that on every screen, in every cafe, in every conversation, his name was being dragged through the mud. The phone rang again. This time it was his lawyer. "Ricardo, the situation is serious," said the voice on the other end of the line. "They have filed formal complaints. They are painting you as the leader of a corruption network. If you don't respond soon, you could face legal proceedings." Ricardo clenched his teeth. "How can I respond when all they show are documents that look authentic?" The lawyer was silent for a few seconds. "You need stronger evidence than theirs. Otherwise, this war will not be won in court, but in the headlines." He hung up and took a deep breath. It was clear. The battle was no longer just internal. Now it was being played out in the arena of public opinion, where the truth was worth less than the most appealing narrative. Hours later, the news was broadcasting live interviews with financial analysts. They all seemed to agree. Ricardo Villalobos' name had fallen into disgrace. One of the experts described him as an example of how big businessmen often hide shady practices behind facades of success. His name was trending on social media. Thousands of comments insulted him. Others called for investigations. Some defended his career, but most had already condemned him without trial. Isabel sat in front of the television with a hardened expression on her face. Mariana, at her side, watched the images with a mixture of confusion and sadness. "Why are they saying that about him, Mom?" the girl asked. "He's not bad." Isabel hugged her. "Because sometimes those with money and power make up stories to destroy those who get in their way." Ricardo listened from the hallway. Isabel's words pierced him. He remembered his own skepticism toward her days ago, when he accused her of making things up. Now it was he who bore the weight of a monumental lie that was sinking him. He sat down next to them in silence. Mariana looked at him with wide eyes, full of trust. "Don't listen to them," said the girl. "I know the truth." Ricardo stroked her head. That simple phrase, so childish and yet so powerful, gave him a glimmer of strength. Maybe it was true. Someone had to believe him so that he himself would not collapse. That night, while the city slept, Ricardo stayed awake in front of the fireplace, watching the fire slowly burn out. The enemy was no longer a shadow in the offices or a whisper in the hallways. Now it was a strident voice repeated in newspapers, on television, and on social media. It was a tide that sought to drag him down, to reduce his name to a synonym for corruption. But in that nocturnal silence, with Isabel and Mariana sleeping in nearby rooms, he made a personal decision. He would not give up because if he fell, he would not only lose his company, he would also lose the only two people who, in the midst of the collapse, looked at him with faith, and that faith was the only thing that kept him standing. The house on the hill had fallen into an eerie silence after the media attacks. During the day, Ricardo spent hours on the phone trying to contain the storm that was harassing him from outside. But one night that silence was broken by a different sound, Mariana's persistent cough. Isabel was the first to notice it. She got out of bed when she heard her daughter moving restlessly and discovered that she was burning up with fever. Her forehead was drenched in sweat, and her dry lips could barely utter broken words. "Mariana, hi," she whispered with a sinking heart. The girl opened her eyes with effort. "My throat hurts, Mom." Isabel was alarmed. She took a damp cloth and placed it on her daughter's forehead, but the fever continued to rise. Desperate, she went out into the hallway to look for Ricardo. He was still awake, reviewing some documents by the fireplace. When he saw her arrive with a distraught look on her face, he immediately stood up. "What's wrong?" "It's Mariana. She's burning up with fever." Without thinking, Ricardo followed her to the room, knelt by the bed, and took the girl's hand. The heat emanating from her skin pierced his chest like a blow. "We have to take her to the doctor," he said firmly. "We can't," Isabel replied anxiously. "It's not safe to go out now after everything that's happened." Ricardo pressed his lips together. He knew she was right. The world outside had become too dangerous for them. "Then we'll take care of her here," he decided. "I'll take care of getting whatever we need." The early hours of the morning passed in a blur of cold compresses, syrups, and bedside vigils. Isabel never left Mariana's side, but what surprised her was seeing Ricardo, always impeccable and distant, sitting in a wooden chair, watching over the girl's sleep as if she were his own flesh and blood. At times, Mariana raved, muttering incoherent words, reliving fragments of conversations, mixing memories with dreams. One of those nights, she opened her eyes and took Ricardo's hand. "Don't go, Daddy." Ricardo's heart sank. He didn't have the strength to correct her. He just squeezed her hand tenderly. "I'm here, Mariana. I'm not going anywhere." Isabel watched the scene in silence. That word, Dad, which had so baffled her at first, seemed to fit more and more with the way the girl looked at him. The following days were a test. The fever rose and fell, and Ricardo never left the house. He clumsily prepared soups. He learned to take her temperature. He even read her stories in a slow voice to help her fall asleep. One afternoon, when Mariana finally managed to sleep without waking up, Ricardo went out into the garden to get some air. Isabel found him there with his arms crossed and his gaze lost on the horizon. "I never imagined myself in this situation," he confessed without taking his eyes off the trees. "I was never a father. I never had that opportunity." Isabel looked at him intently. There was sincerity in his voice, a vulnerability he had rarely shown. "And yet, now you are," she replied. Ricardo turned to her in surprise. "I'm not her father. Maybe not by blood," Isabel admitted. "But these days Mariana looks at you as if you were. And that, believe me, is worth more than any surname." Ricardo looked down, feeling a lump in his throat. "I never thought anyone could depend on me like that. I've run a company. I've made decisions that affected thousands of employees. But this is different. This is feeling that my life has another meaning." Isabel remained silent for the first time since she had known him. She saw him without the armor of a powerful businessman, without the ego that had always accompanied him. She saw him as a man who was discovering for the first time what it was like to be needed, to be loved. And although her instincts urged her to be wary, she couldn't help but feel something inside her begin to soften. That night, while Mariana slept peacefully for the first time in days, Ricardo and Isabel shared a simple dinner in the kitchen. The atmosphere was different. There was no longer just tension and suspicion. There was an invisible thread that united them, forged in sleepless nights and shared vulnerability. Ricardo looked up at her and smiled tiredly but sincerely. "Thank you for trusting me with Mariana." Isabel held his gaze for a few seconds and, unable to help herself, smiled back. It was the first time she had done so, and although neither of them said it out loud, they knew that something was changing between them. A bond, as unexpected as it was unbreakable, was beginning to grow amid the chaos. A true blood bond, born not of biology, but of devotion and faith. Mariana's fever had subsided, and the apparent calm in the house on the hill allowed Ricardo to focus on something other than fear for the first time in days. The enemy had made strong advances in the media, but now he too had a growing arsenal. Documents, copies hidden by Isabel, and some recordings he had received some time ago from a loyal employee. Those recordings were fragments of telephone calls intercepted by chance, audio files he had never been able to decipher completely, distorted voices, conversations in hallways, and clandestine meetings. Until now, they had been loose pieces, too vague to become solid evidence. Ricardo opened his laptop on the living room table and arranged folders, papers, and a tape recorder. Isabel sat across from him, organizing the documents into small piles. Mariana, still weak but recovering, approached with curiosity. "Can I help?" the girl asked. Ricardo looked at her with a faint smile. "Of course. Maybe you'll see what we don't." The first recording began with a buzzing sound and then a male voice. It was deep, with a mocking tone. "If we press him hard enough, he'll sign without realizing it. The old man is tired." Ricardo paused the audio. "I've heard this 1,000 times, but I've never been able to identify the voice." Mariana frowned, closed her eyes, and concentrated. After a few seconds, she opened them wide. "It's the man with the gold watch," she exclaimed. "I heard him say that same phrase once in the hallways. He always shows off his watch and talks as if he thinks he's smarter than everyone else." Ricardo looked at her in amazement. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Mariana replied with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "I recognize how he elongates the words at the end." Isabel exchanged a glance with Ricardo. The girl was completing a puzzle that he alone had never been able to solve. They played the next recording with Julian in charge. "It will be a matter of weeks. Villalobos has no idea." Ricardo clenched his fists. That phrase had tormented him ever since he heard it. But the voice, although familiar, he had never been able to associate with anyone in particular. Mariana leaned toward the computer, listened carefully, and then whispered, "That's the man with the gray beard. I saw him meeting with Julian one day near the elevators. I thought he was a supplier, but now I remember his voice." Ricardo took a deep breath. The puzzle was taking shape. They were no longer shadows, but faces with names and faces. For hours, they reviewed recording after recording. Mariana identified tones, verbal tics, laughter. Isabel pointed out documents that matched the dates mentioned in the audios. Ricardo wrote down connections in a notebook, increasingly convinced that they were dealing with an organized network, not a simple isolated fraud. At one point, Mariana yawned but insisted on continuing. "Let me listen to one more, please." Ricardo hesitated but gave in. He played a particularly murky audio recording. "And when he falls, we will be seen as the saviors. The public always needs a villain." The girl frowned thoughtfully. "That voice," she murmured. "It's the same one that scared me that night in the house. I didn't see him clearly, but now I'm sure." Ricardo felt a chill. The certainty in Mariana's voice shook him. Her memory wasn't just a talent, it was an unexpected weapon, capable of dismantling the charade that surrounded him. When they finished, the table was covered with notes, arrows, names, and dates. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, exhausted but with a clearer mind than ever. "Now I know who they are," he said, looking at Isabel and Mariana. "I don't have all the evidence I need, but they're no longer faceless shadows." Isabel looked at him firmly. "And if we know who they are, we also know how to face them." Mariana, curled up in her chair, looked at them with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "I just listened," she whispered. Ricardo leaned over and stroked her hair. "No, Mariana, you gave us the missing pieces. Without you, we would still be in the dark." The girl smiled weakly. For the first time since it all began, Ricardo felt that the board was not as unbalanced as he had thought. The enemy was powerful, yes, but the net was beginning to close in on them as well. The afternoon had fallen heavily, with low clouds darkening the city ahead of time. Ricardo was reviewing the documents and audio recordings organized on the living room table for the umpteenth time when his phone vibrated with an urgent notification. It was a video message sent from an unknown number. He opened it cautiously. The image was blurry at first, but soon became clear. A man, with his hands tied behind his back, sitting on a metal chair in a windowless room. The light from a bare bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slowly. Ricardo immediately recognized the kidnapped man, Hernan Ortega, one of his longest-serving employees, an honest accountant who had been with him since the early years of the company. The distorted voice of a hooded man broke the silence. "Listen carefully, Villalobos. If you want to see your man alive again, you'll have to sign the contract. You have 48 hours, not a minute more." The video ended abruptly. Ricardo stared at the screen, his muscles tense and his heart racing. Isabel, who was nearby, approached the armada. "What was that?" Ricardo showed her the video. Isabel put her hand to her mouth in horror. They kidnapped him. Ricardo nodded slowly as if the weight of the confirmation was crushing him. They're not content with ruining my name. Now they're using my men as hostages. Mariana, who had been in the kitchen, peeked out with wide eyes when she noticed the tension. What happened? Nothing you need to see, Ricardo replied firmly, putting his phone in his pocket. But the girl, as always, sensed more than what was shown to her. That night, Ricardo couldn't get the image of Hernan out of his mind. He remembered how he had trusted him from the beginning, when they could barely pay salaries, and how Hernan had never betrayed him. He was always the man who stayed late to balance the books, the one who defended the company when others had doubts. Now they were using him as a bargaining chip. Ricardo paced back and forth in the living room with Isabel sitting across from him. If I sign, I'll lose everything I've built, the company, my name, my future, and there's no guarantee they'll release him. And if you don't sign, Isabel didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The silence weighed heavily between them. The unspoken question was whether it was worth sacrificing everything for one man, even if he was loyal. Ricardo closed his eyes, remembering his own loneliness from years ago. He had always put business above people and had paid the price with his marriage and an empty life. Now, faced with this crossroads, he realized that much more than financial statements were at stake. I can't let them kill him, he whispered, his voice breaking. No, Hernan. Isabel watched him silently. There was hardness in her face, but also a new respect. Then he'll have to find another way out, because if he signs, they win. Ricardo slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt torn between two loyalties that seemed irreconcilable: save a loyal friend or protect the future of everyone else. The next day, another message arrived. This time it was just a short note. Last warning, sign or you'll lose him. Clock is ticking. The clock. The word echoed in his mind. He remembered the mocking voice of that investor with the gold watch, one of the ones Mariana had identified in the recordings. They were playing with him, pressing on each of his weaknesses. Mariana approached timidly when she saw him overwhelmed. Dad, she said softly, using the word without hesitation. When I was sick, you took care of me and said you wouldn't leave me alone. Are you going to leave that man alone? Ricardo looked up in surprise. Mariana's childish logic cut through him like a knife. It wasn't a business argument or a strategy. It was pure heart. And although he knew the situation was infinitely more complex, those words reminded him of something essential. What was at stake was not just numbers, but human lives. Night fell with a tense silence. Ricardo stood by the fire, watching as the flames slowly consumed the wood. He felt that time was running against him, that each spark was 1 second less on the invisible clock that the conspirators had set in motion. He had to decide, and whatever his choice, he knew it would mark him forever. The blackmail had put him at the hardest crossroads of his life. Give in and lose everything, or resist and risk the life of an innocent man. For the first time, Ricardo understood firsthand what it meant to be caught in an ethical dilemma with no way out. And although he still didn't know how to respond, he swore he wouldn't let his enemies dictate the outcome. The morning dawned gray and humid, as if the sky shared the gloom of the house on the hill. Ricardo had been standing motionless in front of the window for hours, watching the fog cover the city in the distance. The decision he had to make weighed on his shoulders like a slab: sign and give up everything he had built, or confront the conspirators, knowing that the price could be his life and the lives of those around him. The image of Hernan in chains remained etched in his mind. The threatening messages, the media campaigns, the direct attacks, every move his enemies made was a reminder that he was cornered. And yet, within that suffocation, something was beginning to ignite. The conviction that the only way out was to stop hiding. Ricardo took a deep breath. I'm not signing anything, he said quietly but firmly. Isabel, who was in the kitchen making coffee, heard him. She approached slowly, her brow furrowed. Then what are you going to do? He turned to her. His gaze had a different gleam, not of resignation but of resolve. I'm going to confront them publicly. Isabel watched him silently, as if processing each word. She knew what it meant to expose himself on a stage where the conspirators controlled the media, the judges, and the narrative. It was a suicidal gamble, but also the only one that could break the shadow in which they had enclosed him. A press conference, Ricardo continued, in front of the cameras, in front of the whole country. No more rumors, no more voices in the dark. If they want to destroy me, they'll have to do it in broad daylight. Isabel set the coffee down on the table. That could cost us everything. I know. His voice did not waver, but it may also be our only chance to show who they really are. Silence stretched out for a few seconds, broken only by the faint crackling of the wood in the fireplace. Finally, Isabel nodded. Then you won't be alone. If you expose yourself, so will I. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't expected her, who had always lived in invisibility, to take such a risky step. Before he could respond, Mariana appeared in the doorway of the room, her hair still tousled from sleep, but her eyes wide awake. I'm coming too, she said firmly. Ricardo and Isabel exchanged alarmed glances. Mariana, no, her mother said quickly. This is too dangerous. The girl frowned and crossed her arms. I heard the truth and I want to tell it. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Ricardo looked at her, impressed by the strength she radiated, despite her young age. There was a determination in her eyes that was not childish. It was the reflection of someone who had already seen too much and who somehow understood that her voice could make a difference. Mariana, Ricardo began softly, this is not a game. There are men out there who would not hesitate to hurt you. I know, she replied without hesitation. But if I stay silent, they win, and I don't want them to win. Isabel closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It was the same stubbornness he had seen in his daughter before, but this time it stemmed from a much greater conviction. Ricardo bent down to her level. Your courage is the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life, he said, his voice breaking. But I need you to understand that what you say out there cannot be undone. Mariana stared at him. Then I'll speak louder. Isabel placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, resigned but moved. Ricardo, for his part, felt a mixture of pride and fear. He was aware that if he accepted her request, he was allowing a 9-year-old girl to face the same monsters that were pursuing him, but he also knew that her innocence could be the strongest blow against the conspirators. That afternoon, the preparations began. Ricardo contacted a small group of journalists whom he still considered impartial. He announced that in 2 days he would call a press conference to give the version that no one was listening to. Isabel organized the documents and recordings, classifying them so that they would be understandable to the public. Mariana quietly reviewed the phrases she had memorized, determined to repeat them in front of whoever was necessary. The atmosphere in the house was tense, but it also vibrated with a new energy. For the first time, Ricardo did not feel like a fugitive or a cornered man, but someone advancing toward the enemy. As night fell, he sat down in front of the fire with Isabel and Mariana. We may not have another chance, he said quietly, but if we fall, we will fall together telling the truth. Isabel looked at him silently, and although fear was still present in her eyes, there was also respect. Mariana rested her head on Ricardo's shoulder and whispered, Don't be afraid, Dad. Ricardo closed his eyes. That word, which at first had disconcerted and hurt him, now sustained him. Because when he heard it, he understood that he was not alone. The decision was made. The battle would no longer be fought in the shadows. Now it would be in the light. The conference room was packed. Television cameras, recorders, flashes, and dozens of journalists formed an expectant swarm. The constant murmur died down as soon as Ricardo Villalobos appeared on stage accompanied by Isabel and with Mariana sitting in the front row. He was wearing a dark suit, but he was not wearing his usual corporate tie. His serious and tired expression revealed that he was not there as just another businessman, but as a man who was risking everything in a single move. He adjusted the microphone and let the silence linger for a couple of seconds. For weeks, my name has been tarnished with false accusations. He began in a deep but firm voice. They have said that I am corrupt, that my company is built on fraud, that I am not worthy of this country's trust. A murmur ran through the room. Ricardo raised his hand and spread several documents on the table. Today, I will show you the truth. He took out copies of illegal transfers, contracts with forged signatures, and duplicate invoices. Journalists rushed forward with cameras to capture the papers. Ricardo held up one sheet in particular. Here you can see my supposed signature, but if you compare it with any of my official documents, you will notice the difference. These are not the hands of a businessman. They are the hands of fraudsters who have tried to take over my company. Flashes lit up his face. In the audience, some nodded in surprise. Others wrote frantically in their notebooks. Ricardo continued, I am not speaking alone. I have received testimonies from employees, evidence recovered from the trash, documents hidden for years by those who refused to remain silent. Isabel nodded from her seat, her eyes fixed on him. Ricardo clung to that gaze as if it were an anchor. Suddenly, a voice rose from the crowd. It was one of the investor representatives who had attended with several of his allies. He stood up indignantly. This is a circus, he exclaimed, addressing the cameras as much as Ricardo. Villalobos is trying to save himself by inventing a conspiracy. His documents proved nothing but his desperation. Others in his group backed him up. Papers can be forged. Where is the evidence that you are not the author of those transfers? The atmosphere immediately became tense. The journalists began firing questions at the same time. You have witnesses. Why should we believe you and not the official investigations? Isn't this just an attempt to clear your name? Ricardo clenched his fists on the lectern. He knew the conspirators would not come unarmed. They had prepared their lines, their accusations, their counter-arguments, and now they were using doubt as a weapon. He took a deep breath and raised his voice. What I am presenting today are not fabrications. They are fragments of a truth that they have wanted to hide. I know they will try to discredit me, that they will come with prepared speeches, but the truth, even if they sully it, always finds a way to come to light. The room was once again filled with murmurs. The air was so thick that it seemed as if everyone was holding their breath. In the front row, Mariana watched him with fiery eyes. Ricardo looked at her for a second and knew that there was still one more powerful blow to be dealt, but it was not he who would deliver it. The tension in the room reached its peak. The battle for the truth had begun live. The murmuring in the room was deafening. The conspirators were fighting back. The journalists were firing questions, and Ricardo felt that the truth could be lost amid the noise. Then Mariana rose from her seat. The girl walked with small steps to the lectern. Ricardo tried to stop her, but Isabel looked at her with teary eyes and nodded silently. Mariana took the microphone with both hands. She was pale, her lips were trembling, and for a moment it seemed that no words would come out of her mouth. I heard everything, she finally said in a thin voice. The commotion died down immediately. Dozens of cameras turned toward her, and the journalists fell silent as if time had stopped. The girl swallowed, took a deep breath, and continued with more confidence. One night I hid in the hallways of the company. I heard those men talking about a contract to take everything away from Mr. Villalobos. They said, when he signs, he won't realize that he's giving up everything. The echo of the phrase reverberated through the room. No one moved. Mariana continued without taking her eyes off the conspirators. I also heard, he thinks he needs us, but in reality, we have him cornered. As she repeated those words, her intonation was so precise, so identical to the original voice, that some journalists immediately turned toward the group of investors. They tensed up and tried to maintain their composure, but the sweat on their foreheads gave them away. Mariana gripped the microphone tightly. I am a child, but I do not lie. I recognize your voices. It was you. The silence that followed was absolute. There was no sound of camera flashes or computer keyboards, only the child's voice floating in the air, so clear that no prepared defense could counter it. One of the investors tried to stand up to deny it, but another clumsily pushed him back down. That gesture, captured by all the cameras, seemed like a silent confession. Ricardo looked at her with pride and a lump in his throat. Isabel, with tears running down her cheeks, knew that this moment would be recorded forever. The weight of innocence had done what no document, no speech had ever achieved. It had broken through the armor of lies. The echo of Mariana's words still reverberated in the room when chaos erupted. The journalists stood up, shouting questions. The cameras focused on the investors, and the flashes multiplied like lightning. One of the conspirators, the man with the gold watch, stood up furiously. It's a farce. You can't take a little girl seriously. But in his attempt to defend himself, he contradicted himself. We never said Villalobos was cornered. He stopped abruptly, realizing too late what he had revealed. The murmurs turned into a roar. The journalist picked up on the phrase instantly. "How do you know what was said?" asked a reporter, pointing her microphone at him. The man stammered, unable to respond. At his side, another investor sweated and shook his head awkwardly, but every gesture sank him further. The tension grew, and the cameras broadcast the spectacle of his collapse live. Then the auditorium doors opened and the police entered, alerted by the evidence handed in before the conference. The officers advanced through the crowd and without hesitation approached the accused men. The audience held its breath as they were handcuffed in front of everyone. Ricardo watched with a racing heart as the villains who had played with his name and his life for weeks were dragged out of the room under the flash of hundreds of cameras. But the hardest scene was yet to come. Julian appeared among the detainees. His face, previously unperturbed, now showed a mixture of anger and defeat. When his gaze met Ricardo's, he barely managed to whisper, "You shouldn't have challenged me." Ricardo did not respond. All he did was take Mariana's hand, who looked at him with her courage intact. The crowd, witnessing everything, burst into applause. Some journalists were broadcasting live, and videos of the little girl were going viral on social media, repeating the conspirators' phrases, her voice trembling at first and then firm, confronting corrupt businessmen. The headlines changed in a matter of minutes. The girl who disarmed the powerful. Villalobos proves the conspiracy. Leave arrests. Isabel, standing at the side of the stage, had tears in her eyes. It had been a journey full of fear and threats, but now she saw with her own eyes the collapse of those who had believed themselves untouchable. Ricardo, his chest heaving, understood that this was not just a personal triumph, it was a moral triumph built on the unexpected courage of a little girl and the dignity of a mother who never allowed herself to be broken. The auditorium was still vibrating with the echoes of applause and camera flashes when the tension began to dissipate. The conspirators were in custody, the journalists were still broadcasting live, and for the first time in a long time, Ricardo Villalobos could breathe without feeling a dagger in his back. He turned and saw Mariana, the girl who had disarmed men accustomed to manipulating everything with her innocence, looked at him with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Ricardo knelt in front of her in the middle of the stage, still illuminated by spotlights. He took her hand gently. "That day you called me Dad to save me," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "But if you'll let me, I want to be your dad forever." Mariana's eyes widened in surprise at first, then a broad smile lit up her face. She threw herself into his arms and hugged him tightly. "Yes, Dad." Ricardo's heart was filled with an unfamiliar warmth, so intense that it almost overwhelmed him. For years he had lived surrounded by contracts, balance sheets, and meetings, convinced that loneliness was the price of his success. Now he understood that it was all just a facade. Isabel, with tears running down her cheeks, approached. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the certainty that they were doing something new there in front of everyone. "If this is what Mariana wants," she said in an emotional voice, "I accept it too." Ricardo looked at her gratefully. It had been her silent strength that had kept documents safe, resisted threats, and supported her daughter with dignity. Now, by accepting it, she was also opening the doors to a home he had never had. The audience moved, captured every moment. Social media, which minutes earlier had been ablaze with the collapse of the villains, was now filled with videos of the embrace between the businessman, the girl, and the mother. Days later, the company stabilized. Employees regained confidence, legitimate investors backed Ricardo, and the justice system began to unravel the web of corruption. But for Ricardo, all that was secondary. One afternoon, sitting in the garden of the house on the hill, he watched Mariana run among the trees while Isabel laughed in the distance. He felt a calmness that financial triumphs had never given him. Then he understood with absolute clarity. His true legacy was not in the contracts he had signed or the company's shares. It was in that childish laughter that filled the air with life, in that woman who now looked at him with confidence, in the home they had begun to build together. That was true wealth, unity, love, and the certainty that you were no longer alone. Thank you for joining us here. Remember to subscribe, leave your like, and tell us in the comments what you thought of the story and where you are watching us from. See you next time.